코드 블루 레드. 코드 블루 레드. 이거 보이시죠? 지금 60도예요. 각도가. 얘 앉아있는 거 보이시죠? 얘는 지금 정자세로 앉아있는데 이게 60도. 보이죠? 나 무섭다 진짜. 나 이거 어떡하냐. 나 무서워. 나 살고 싶어. 나 구명조끼 입었어요.
뒤지기 싫어요. 지금 이 상황은 지금 기울어지고 있습니다.
나 뒤지기 싫어.
진짜 물 들어가면 진짜 우리 나가야 돼요. 엄마한테 전화해볼까? 엄마가 마지막이지. 기울어졌어.
야, 나 좀 살려줘. 진짜 침새는 거 아니야?
진짜 장난 아니야. 내리고 싶어. 진짜 진심이야.
야 빨리 구하라고!
야, 여기 만약에.
야, 나 진짜 죽는 거 아니야?
야, 이거 존나 흔하지 않는 일 아니야? 기울어져.
더 기울어진다고? 장난? 우리 뒤지기 싫다고. 아니, 뒤져도 별사실 물이 들어오긴 하나요? 와, 기울 줄은 상상도 못했다. 우리 구명조끼 꺼냈다.
야, 진짜 점점 기울어져. 우리 지금 이거 실전이라고 정말 장난이 아니야.
그래, 난 지금 그래서 빠져나가야겠다고. 나 간다고. 하면서 찍고 있다 지금.
빨리. 야, 엄마 사랑해요.
못 보내 임마.
씨발, 엄마 사랑해요. 뭐가 어떤 데 돌아가는 거야, 진짜.
진짜 신모네요? 우와, 구명조끼도.
아직 못 본 애니가 많단 말이에요.
아직 못 본 애니가 맞다고.
완전 안 났어.
아이, 왜?
선장은 뭐 하길래?
아니, 뭔가 걸린 거 같아. 타이타닉 된 거 같아. 전화 안 터진다고?
안 터져.
아, 망했다. 마지막 갈말이 남기고 주가 된 거 같은데.
자, 지금 남기려면.
녹음해.
녹음이야, 지금. 동영상이야.
제발. 말씀아, 이따가 엄마, 아빠 사랑해요, 씨발.
자, 너야. 다음에.
이 씨발, 존나 깜빡하게 문자 보고. 엄마, 아빠, 내 동생 어떨까? 내 동생 말은 절대로 가수련에 가지 말라 해야겠다.
야 그거 좀 뒤쪽.
야, 이거 뉴스 뜬다. 야, 내가 학생 100% 한다. 이거 뉴스 뜬다.
안 떠, 이런 걸로.
아니야,
신문
이거-
안 하면.
지금 침몰하는데?
신문 안 할 거야. 안 해야만 돼.
지금 상황은 지금 배가 기울었습니다. 지금 애들이 다 곤란한 상태고요. 여기 물이 다 찼어요. 여기 물이 화장실 물이 지금 다 샜고요. 여기 보시면 지금 배가 기울었거든요. 보이시죠? 지금 일자예요. 일자로 찍고 있는 건데 이 정도로 기울었어요. 거의 한 60도 기울어진 거죠. 지금 구조대가 오고 있대요. 해상 구조대. 내가 왜 수학여행을 와서 나는 꿈이 있는데 나는 살고 싶은데 내가 진짜 나 울 것 같은데 나 진짜 나 웁니다. 나 아씨 나 개무섭습니다. 지금 나 이거 입고 있어요. 지금 나 무섭다고. 아니 구조대가 오면 얼마나 위험한 상황이냐고요. 지금 구조대 와도 300명을 어떻게 구합니까? 이거 어떻게 합니까 내가.
아니 헬기가 오면은 이렇게 배 이렇게 딱 잡아서 띄워주는 거 아니야?
헬기가 이걸 어떻게 잡아줍니까? 해경이랑 어선이 오고 있답니다. 내가 왜 제주도를 오하마르나호를 안 타서 세월호를 타서 이런 진짜 욕도 나오는데 어른들한테 보여줄 거라 욕도 못하고 진짜 무섭고 난 지금 숨이 턱끝까지 차오르는데 이거 끈 꽉 묶었습니다. 저는 난 살고 싶습니다. 네, 마지막으로 진짜 나는 진짜 하고 싶은 게 많은데 진짜 나 무서워요 지금. 나 어떡해요? What can I do? 네, 지금 배 상황입니다. 지금 전기가 통제됐고요.
끊겼고요.
네, 전기가 끊겼고요. 진짜 어떻게 해야 될지 모르겠습니다. 해경이 거의 다 왔다고 하는데 나 살고 싶어요. 진짜로. 나 리얼리 나 진짜 이런 진지 빨고 말한 적 없거든요. 좋습니다. 네, 살아서 봅시다. 와, 해경 온답니다. 네, 와 진짜 나 살고 싶어요. 살고 싶어요. 지금 네, 여기 영상에 많은 걸 남깁니다. 네, 관령아 넌 참 좋은 친구였고, 정윤아 넌 씨발 맨날 교회 나오라니까 안 나오고, 남길이랑은 마지막으로 만나서 논 게 참 좋네요. 네, 할머니 아빠 사랑하고, 네, 누나 참 많이 싸웠는데 참 고맙고, 네, 형 마지막으로 보고 싶었는데 형 못 보고 가네요. 네, 진짜. 그리고 또 한결이 형 군대 갔는데 왜 이렇게 이런 상황만 겹치니. 형이 나의 행운의 고향이었나봐. 형이 없으니까 계속 안 좋은 일만 생겨. 이거 어떻게 할 거야? 그리고 잠깐만요, 제가 뒤에 지금 무서운 걸 봤는데 이거 1994년도에 만든 네 구명조끼입니다. 네, 뒤에 10분 동안 여기서 버티랍니다. 이 개자식들 없애버릴 거예요. 네, 보트가 왔습니다. 네, 아까가 마지막이라고 했지만 전 살고 싶습니다. 네, 지금 여기 제가 있는 방엔 3명이 투숙 중이고요. 투숙 중인데 이런 씨발 니들이 그따구로 이 배를 운전? 지금 배는 85도. 내 머릿속 온도는 지금 100도. 니들을 칠 캐리어들은 침몰 위기?
진짜 계속 기울어. 저기 커튼 봐. 이거 원래 이 이유이 아니었어.
상황 보이죠? 지금 물이 찼어요. 배가 잠기고 있거든요. 배가 잠기고 있어요. 제가 애들 지금 잠기고 있어요. 지금 잠기고 있습니다. 네. 지금 잠기고 있습니다.
이거 바꿔야겠네.
엄마 사랑해요. 아빠 사랑해요. 둘 다 사랑해요. 우리 김영희 씨 아들이 고맙니다. 이번 일로 죽을 수 있을 것 같으니.
야, 계단에 있는 얘들이 제일 무서워.
엄마 아빠 사랑해요. 영원아. 영원아, 너만은 제발 수학여행 가지마. 오빠처럼 되기 싫으면. 알았지? 제발 살려줘. 마지막이야. 나 지금 기울어진 거 보이지? 안 보이겠어. 저기서 태평하게 핸드폰 만지고 있는 거 한국인 앞에. 이게 뭔 상황인지 모르겠어. 구명조끼 입으라는 거 침몰되고 있다는 소리 아니야?
진짜 바다로
실제 상황이야. 수연아, 마지막. 진짜 팔기 보소. 나도. 우리.
On April 16th, 2014, the MV Sewol Ferry in South Korea was on its way to the island of Jeju with 476 people on board, including 325 second-year high school students who were on a field trip, when it met with disaster that resulted in the loss of over 300 lives. At 8:52 a.m., the first signs of trouble were reported to a fire officer after one of the high school students on board used his mobile phone to call an emergency number and reported that the ship had begun sinking. At 8:55, the crew of the ship contacted the Jeju Harbor Affairs to report their situation. At the same time, the crew broadcast an announcement to the passengers telling them to stay in their cabins because it would be much safer there, despite orders from the Harbor Affairs personnel at Jeju and Jindo Islands telling them to prepare the passengers and crew for evacuation. The reason being that the captain of the ferry, Lee Jun-seok, claims he wanted confirmation that rescue parties would arrive soon because he was afraid people would be swept away by the currents if they entered the cold water. This conversation between the crew and harbor affairs continued for over 40 minutes when at 9:37 a.m., the Sewol ferry crew claims that it had broadcast an order to evacuate the ship. However, by this time, the ferry was tilting at such an extreme angle towards its port side that it was very difficult for anyone to escape the ship. Around 9:30 a.m., the Korean Coast Guard arrived with a cutter boat that dropped a rubber raft and a few helicopters that began deploying divers in the area to help fleeing passengers. The Coast Guard made no attempt to enter the sinking ship that was tilting close to 70 degrees to its side, and in 40 minutes' time only managed to save 20 passengers that mostly consisted of the ferry captain and crew who were the first to abandon the ship. 2 fishery patrol boats arrived at 10:08 a.m. and in 10 minutes managed to rescue 50 survivors. 30 private vessels arrived to offer assistance and rescued another 40 passengers. At 10:51, more Coast Guard rescue ships entered the scene, but by that time, the Sewol ferry had already sunk beneath the water except for a small section of the ship that was sticking out above the surface. When the disaster first occurred, some media outlets reported that all passengers had been saved, and an official from the Danwon High School sent out a message stating that all 338 students and teachers on board had been rescued safely. But this misinformation only caused confusion and possibly slowed emergency rescue efforts by downplaying the seriousness of the situation. In the following days after the disaster, it was revealed that South Korean officials ignored offers of help from other countries. On April 17th, Prime Minister of Japan Shinzo Abe sent a message to South Korean President Park Geun-hye, which stated, "We would like to express our condolences and sympathy. Japan is prepared to provide the necessary support." In a meeting between the Japanese and South Korean Coast Guards, the Korean side refused assistance, stating that, "We very much appreciate the offer, but currently, we have no special need for assistance." Diving operations took place over the next 7 months following the disaster, with up to 555 divers in the water at one point from multiple government agencies and private organizations. But their attempts to retrieve more passengers and supply the possible air pockets inside the sunken ship were unsuccessful, as more and more dead bodies were retrieved from the wreckage. Out of the 476 people on board the Sewol, 172 were rescued before the ship went down, with 304 lives lost beneath the waves, including 250 children from the Danwon High School. During those months the search and rescue was happening, a Navy petty officer fell into a coma and died after sustaining serious injuries. 2 divers lost their lives, and 5 personnel that included 2 pilots, 2 rescue workers, and a mechanic died after their helicopter crashed on a sidewalk in the city of Gwangju. The crash also injured a nearby high school student. 2 days after the ferry sunk, the vice principal of Danwon High School hanged himself from a tree with a belt near a gymnasium where families of the ferry victims were staying. In a suicide note, he wrote that it was his idea for the field trip and that the deaths of the students were his fault. He said he could not live knowing where his students are. He also wrote that he wonders whether he could still be their teacher on the other side in death. The MV Sewol was purchased by Geun-hye Marine Company on October 8, 2012. The ship was originally owned by A-Line Ferry, a company in Japan who claims the ship did not experience any problems in its 18 years of service. However, after its purchase, the Geun-hye Company restructured the ship so it could hold more passengers and cargo. These modifications were illegal and made the ship unbalanced, but somehow it had passed inspection with the Korean Register of Shipping. An investigation by the Board of Audit and Inspection later revealed that the licensing from the Korean Register of Shipping was based on falsified documents. During approval, the Korean Register of Shipping reduced the maximum amount of cargo that could be carried from 1,450 tons to 987 tons, and increased the amount of ballast needed from 1,333 tons to 1,703 tons. The cargo limits were not known by the Korea Shipping Association, which has the responsibility to manage ferries, or by the Korea Coast Guard, which was responsible for overseeing the shipping association. Investigations revealed that the family that owned the largest shareholdings of Geun-hye Marine Company had been embezzling money from Geun-hye as well as many other companies they owned and controlled through majority shareholdings by hiring family members and trusted associates to bend the rules or ignore their illegal activities. This included the shipping regulators, who later admitted they would often judge the ferry's weight by eyeing how low the ship was in the water instead of doing proper inspections and tests to be sure it was meeting regulation standards. Many dock workers complained the ship was often overloaded and they weren't getting paid properly because the company misreported the amount of cargo loaded onto the ship. The main culprit was thought to be former chairman of the company, Yoo Byung-eun, a man that had a long history of embezzling money from his own organizations, including followers of a church he created called the Evangelical Baptist Church of Korea. Yoo would use donations from his church to fund various businesses. Yoo, his family, and associates would then siphon money from those companies to line their own pockets. Yoo spent 4 years in prison from 1991 to 1995 for defrauding his church. This investigation was started after 32 members of his church committed mass suicide in the attic of a factory because they did not have enough money to repay loans. When he was released from prison, he continued this networking of embezzlement by having his 2 sons rebuy the businesses at a discount, then placing his family members and trusted church believers in executive jobs while he remained in the background calling the shots on their companies. He began working as a photographer as a way to better his public image and so he could sell overpriced photos to his businesses. Yoo and his associates would often cut corners and break rules so they had more money to drain. The year before the ferry sunk, the company only spent a total of $2 on safety training for the Sewol's crew. This $2 was used to buy a paper copy of a certificate. When the disaster happened, many crew members had no idea what to do. The original captain warned Geun-hye that the ship was dangerously off balance and suffered from many serious problems, but they ignored his concerns and even threatened to fire him if he continued to bring up the matter. The Sewol ferry made 3 round trips per week from the city of Incheon to the island of Jeju. It completed this round trip 241 times before the disaster occurred on the morning of April 16, 2014. Data from the automatic identification system on board the ship showed that the vessel lost control after a sharp right turn of the wheel caused the ferry to list heavily to its port side, where it began to drift sideways in the water. Heavy cargo inside the ferry smashed into the side of the ship due to the cargo not being properly secured by the crew. This, in combination with the modifications to the ship that caused it to be unbalanced, made it impossible for the crew to upright the ship and control it properly. When it sank, the ferry was carrying 3,608 tons of cargo, far over the recommended limit of 987 tons. Also, there was only 580 tons of ballast water on board, only 37% of the legal requirement. In March of 2017, the Sewol ferry was raised onto a floating platform after 3 years on the seafloor and taken to the Mokpo port. On November 11, 2014, Captain Lee Jun-seok was sentenced to 36 years in prison for manslaughter and gross negligence. 14 other crew members were given sentences ranging from 5 to 30 years. However, in April of 2015, an appeals court changed Lee's sentence from manslaughter to murder and gave him a life sentence for abandoning the ship and leaving the passengers to die. The court ruled that Lee failed to instruct passengers to leave the sinking ferry, which resulted in their deaths. Lee was only interested in saving himself instead of looking out for the passengers on board whose safety solely depended upon the captain's instructions in such an emergency, a judge said. Unlike the district court, which recognized Lee's claims that he instructed crew to evacuate passengers, the High Court said evidence did not support this. There is not enough evidence to corroborate his claims because no nearby rescue effort was carried out at the time, the judge said. If they were indeed instructed, it would have resulted in a swift rescue effort. The Coast Guard and the ferry awaiting the rescue operation nearby had no record of any instruction from the Sewol. The court also dismissed crew members' claims that they heard the captain's evacuation orders. Their testimonies lacked credibility and thus had no impact in acquitting Lee of the charges, the court said. It is highly likely that they lied to avoid incriminating themselves. The court deems the testimony of the lowest-ranking crew member truthful for admitting that there was no instructions whatsoever. The 14 other crew members had their sentences reduced during appeals because they were following orders from the captain and the steering wheel of the ship was acting abnormally. The first and second mate, as well as the chief engineer, were charged with homicide instead of murder. After appeals, the crew's sentences ranged from 18 months to 12 years in prison. Kim Geun-hye, the captain of the first Coast Guard ship to arrive as the Sewol ferry sunk, was given a 4-year prison sentence for negligence and making a false report that he had broadcast an evacuation order to the passengers when he had not. The South Korean government eventually disbanded the Coast Guard. Former chairman of Cheonghae Marine Company, Yoo Byung-eun, went into hiding after being summoned to court. Yoo became the most wanted man in South Korea with a $488,000 reward being offered for information leading to his arrest. On June 12th, a body was discovered in a fruit orchard near one of Yoo's vacation homes. On July 21st, 2014, police put out a statement that the body found the previous month was Yoo Byung-eun. Due to decomposition, the cause of death could not be determined. Yoo's eldest son, Dae-kyun, was sentenced to 3 years in prison for embezzling $6.8 million from Cheonghae and 6 other affiliates. 2 of Yoo's brothers, Byung-il and Byung-ho, were found guilty of embezzlement and given 1 year and 2-year prison sentences. Yoo's daughter, Sam-na, was extradited from France to South Korea to face charges for embezzling $43 million from subsidiaries of Cheonghae Marine Company. Yoo's son, Hyuk-ki, was arrested in July of 2020 in New York on charges of embezzlement. Kim Han-sik, the chief executive of Cheonghae Marine Company, was given a 10-year sentence for failing to stop the improper storage and overloaded cargo on the ship that judges ruled contributed to the sinking. His sentence was eventually reduced to 7 years during appeals. 4 other Cheonghae officials were sentenced to 3 to 6 years in prison, and 2 employees from the company received suspended prison sentences. An official from the Korea Shipping Association was sentenced to 3 years in prison for allowing the ferry to leave port without checking its cargo and storage. 2 employees from a private company that loaded the ship received 2-year prison terms. The government and South Korean President Park Geun-hye were heavily criticized for the slow and improper actions taken after the disaster. Investigations found that Park and her administration were more focused on silencing and punishing protesters and critics after a report from the National Intelligence Service was released to the public. On the morning of the disaster, Park wasted 7 hours getting her hair and makeup done, as well as meeting with her best friend, Choi Soon-sil, instead of addressing the ferry disaster in public. Choi Soon-sil was the daughter of a cult leader who was referred to by some as the Korean Rasputin. Choi was also thought to be involved in cult activities, and in February 2018, Choi was sentenced to 20 years in prison for using her connections with Park to pressure companies like Samsung to donate millions of dollars to 2 non-profit organizations she controlled. Vice chairman of Samsung, Lee Jae-young, was sentenced to 2.5 years in prison for donating money to Choi's organizations in exchange for political favors. President Park Geun-hye was impeached for her involvement in the scandal after it was found she gave Choi Soon-sil unauthorized access to official documents. 6 officials were eventually sentenced to prison for creating a blacklist of thousands of artists that criticized and protested the park administration's response to the Sewol ferry disaster. 3 other officials were prosecuted for altering documents that detailed Park's whereabouts while the ferry was sinking. Park Geun-hye was eventually sentenced to 25 years in prison.